Welcome to We Build Great Apartment Communities, the only show dedicated to the process and strategies for transforming apartment buildings to thriving communities. I am your host, John Brackett, and welcome to the show. All right, folks, welcome to another great episode of We Build Great Apartment Communities, the only place where you come to learn how to take apartment buildings and turn them into amazing communities. I have another great guest, and his name is Anthony Vicino. So Anthony has kind of a unique background. For one, he is a best-selling author, real estate investor, and a serial entrepreneur committed to helping people maximize their return on life. Hey, I really like that. Return on life. So we're gonna dive into that today and learn a little bit more about how you do that. And he's a co-founding partner of Invictus Capital. I love the poem, by the way, one of my favorite poems of all time. A multifamily acquisition firm based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, with about $30 million of assets under management. And, you know, their focus is, of course, providing busy working professionals with the opportunity to invest better. And he also hosts a multifamily investing show called Multifamily Investing Made Simple. So, Anthony, welcome to the show, man.
Thanks for having me, dude. I know that this is going to be like a really good conversation because you know the poem Invictus. Like everybody knows the words at the end of that poem, but most people don't know the name of it and where that comes from. So like, I like you, guy. I like you. Yeah. You're sharp.
Poem is one of my all-time favorites, man. Mm-hmm. And if usually people who like that poem, they really understand why.
Yes.
Because I'm the captain of my fate. I am the captain of my fate. No,
it's like that. Yeah. It's a master of my fate and captain of my soul.
I'm the master of my fate. I'm the captain of my soul.
Yeah. But I love it because it's all about extreme accountability. And like, I know, like before we went live, you're talking about the fact that you're on site, like, you know, spot checking, working with the people like on your newest acquisition. And it's like, that's accountability, right? Like that's showing up and doing the work. And that's what that poem means to me is like, it's all about the accountability.
Yeah. For me, that too, for me, it also represents that, you know, in the darkest hours, man, is when you have to show up, right?
Yeah. When
things get really, really tough, whether it be your marriage, your business, mm-hmm. with partners, friendships, your kids, that poem resonates, man, because at the end of the day, you know, we all do a lot more control over the outcomes of our life than we sometimes want to admit, but that's why I love that poem. So, hey, that's go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, you know, I've been like, we've all had dark places in our life. And for me, that poem, and like, and if people that aren't familiar, I highly recommend you go look up the poem Invictus by William Henley. For me, it's a reminder that like, nobody's coming to save you. At the end of the day, like you're it. You got to save yourself, right? And that's empowering or it's terrifying. It's just a matter of how you choose to look at it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I agree, man. I totally agree. I love the poem. Well, hey, really good segue. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
So, I mean, if we go way, way back real quickly, I have severe ADHD, which was like a super defining characteristic of my life. Up until I was about 30 years old. Coming out of college, I had no idea what I wanted to do. I just knew that I couldn't like work in a corporate environment because I was getting fired all the time. I was just like super inconsistent, unfocused, undisciplined, you know, all the things that make for a really bad employee. So coming out of college, I knew I had to go find my own path in life. And that did not lead me to entrepreneurship or real estate investing at that point. Though at that point, I had done some fix and flips and I had done some passive investing, but it wasn't a career. It wasn't something that I was thinking I'm going to pursue this. For me, I wanted just to go out and be free. I wanted to live my life and do my thing. So I became a professional rock climber, which sounds really cool maybe, but it just meant that I lived in the dirt like more nights than not. And I got to climb in really beautiful places, but I didn't make a ton of money. And that came to a head in my life when I tried to marry this woman. I went to her parents. I was like, can I marry your daughter? And they're like, how are you going to provide for our daughter? And I was like, oh, that's brutal. Like that was the first time in my life when like society's expectation of like one's earning potential like really hit me in the face. That relation just didn't work out. I found myself a year later, $80,000 in debt, living in the back of a van. And that's when I started like down my entrepreneurial path because a buddy came to me, saw me in my like depressed, sad state at the rock bottom. And he's like, dude, we got to do something to get you out of this. He's like, come build a business with me. I knew nothing about business at the time, but I was like, I got nothing else to do. So we went off and built a high-rise window washing company, leveraging our skills as rock climbers, our network of rock climbing buddies. And I discovered like, oh my gosh, like being ultimately accountable to like the work that we're doing and building a business, like that resonated with me at such a deep level. It was so much fun. And so that's what I've been doing for the last decade, is just building businesses. Real estate is just another one of those avenues. And it's one of the coolest ones because of all the businesses I've done. It's like, it's really simple. Like the thing about real estate is there's a lot of ways to make money and none of them are terribly complicated once you understand the fundamentals.
Sure.
And you have like this opportunity to make infinite impact. It's super cool. Like, because you get to work with residents and they can also be a pain, but like to know that you're making a positive impact on like your community and the families that you live around, like that you live with. And for us, we invest in our backyard. So like that means a lot to us, but that's the really long convoluted story.
Okay, cool. So, hey, let's unpack some of that, okay? Because I think there's a lot there to be unpacked. So let's talk a little bit about rock climbing and the disciplines that you have been able to take from rock climbing, and then, of course, map that over to building businesses. Because one of the things that I have learned is, and this is why I love sports so much, is, there are oftentimes, when you're training for a sport or you're a professional athlete or you're building some type of extreme expertise in a specific area of your life, whether it be in business, in sports, that usually those skills they're able to be mapped over to the next thing that you do, right? Very common. And so what was that for you? Because I think there are going to be some things that our listeners can draw from.
Yeah, I think the two things, is that skills and character traits are transferable, regardless of what you're doing, what industry that you're in, and what you're pursuing. So if you like develop the character trait of discipline and hard work, whether you're, an athlete or you're an accountant, like that is a character trait that will follow you wherever you go. And that's, for me, was what rock climbing was. In a lot of ways, it taught me two things, which is, one, we seek out the difficulty. Like, we're looking for hard things on purpose. The interesting thing about rock climbing is that there's usually always an easier way to get to the top of the mountain. And as you progress and you improve, you're constantly seeking out, okay, what's the hardest way I could get up there? And we're intentionally putting ourselves in the way of obstacles and challenge, because it's a way for us to test and to grow and to improve as a climber, but also as a person. And I think that's the same in entrepreneurship. We're not always seeking like, how can I make this harder? Or in real estate, we're not thinking about how can I make this harder on myself, but not shying away from doing the hard things. That's one of the things that, if you can develop that as an investor, it's going to serve you super well. The other one is problem solving. Like, when you're trying to get to the top of a mountain or a top of a cliff, like there's a lot of things that are trying to stop you. There's the rock, there's gravity, there's the weather, there's all these factors, right? And it's for you to figure out, well, how am I going to get around these? How am I going to overcome this? And if you want to be a successful real estate investor and build like a successful apartment community, you're going to have a lot of problems that you need to figure out. You have to solve them.
Okay, cool. So a couple of things there that I really, really like. What you just said reminds me of the book, The Obstacle is the Way.
Yeah, Ryan Holiday. Yeah, my boy. Yeah, I like Ron. Yeah.
Yeah, really good book. I love
Stoic philosophy, so you're speaking my love language.
Yeah. Well, really good book, man. I really like that book. So give us an example where you were able to, in the real estate space, maybe a recent example with an investment that you purchased, apartment building, that you had some obstacles. Instead of shying away, you leaned into the obstacles and end up creating, 3x the result, 4x the result. Usually it's a lot more than that, right? Because I've always felt that, the greatest returns that I have been able to generate have been because of my willingness to find problems to solve, right? I mean, ultimately, yes. I'm being paid to find problems to solve. And my job is to make sure that I can find problems that are solvable relative to my time and everything else going on around me, right? All the other opportunities that we see and uncover. So for you, give us an example of that, man. What was that? What did that look like?
Yeah, I think you nailed it on the head there. Like I think Elon Musk said this, is like your compensation is proportional to the magnitude of the problem that you solve. And so the bigger problem that you're trying to solve, like usually there's more there's more upside there. One big one that comes to mind, thinking about last year, we had a deal that it was a beautiful deal. We got all the way to the closing table, literally like a week before closing, and the bank pulled out the rug. And this would have been last May. So May 2021. And a couple of weeks before, new inflationary data had come out. So it was looking like, oh, inflation's a bigger thing than people thought. This community bank, small, they got spooked. They decided to pull the loan. So here we are 1 week before closing. We get the phone call like, we're not going to do the loan. We're like, wait, what? This is completely surprising to us because we've done 4 loans with this bank in the past. We have a really good relationship with them. So it's like really out of the blue for us. And we had just raised about $2.5 million from our investors. So we have $2.5 million sitting here in the bank. We have a week before closing and we don't know what's going to happen with the seller. So in that situation, like you can put your head in the sand and be like, oh, this sucks. What are we going to do? But for us, the first thing we did was immediately call the seller and explain the situation. Here's the deal. Like, we're still committed to getting the deal done. Here's how we're going to show our commitment. So we ended up putting more earnest money in and saying, okay, we're going to double down into this. We're going to get this deal done. We're just going to need to push closing back by a month. And that was a big ask for this guy because he was doing a 1031, right? And so he's like, all right, if you guys screw me over again, like if this gets pushed, like you're putting my 1031 at jeopardy, right? But he took a bet on us and said, okay, let's do this. So we get this deal done a month later, and we're sitting there and we're reflecting on it. And I'm like, okay, the biggest issue for us is like, we know the value of people's time and their money. And when somebody gives us their money, we don't just look at it as they're giving us $1 or $50,000 or whatever. We're looking at it as they exchanged a piece of their life that they will never get back for that money. And they're entrusting us to go and make that money work harder for them than they worked for it. And we weren't able to do that because we told them we were going to close on June 1st, but we closed July 1st. And for a month, their money was just sitting dead in a bank collecting 0.05% interest rate. So we went back to our investors and said, listen, like, we know you were expecting the preferred return, your returns to start generating from this day on June 1st. And that's what we're going to honor, despite the fact that we didn't close until July 1st. And it's the thing that, like, you don't have to do it. But for us, it was like, if we were on the other side of the table and we were the investors on the deal, we're like, what would we expect? What would look like that those guys are putting us before them? And for us, that was a cool situation where we got to solve some problems, and it was an opportunity to display our character too, which felt good in the moment because whenever you can rise to the occasion, it feels good. Sometimes you don't, and then it doesn't feel good.
Of course. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about process, right? Because inside of this space, there are a lot of different ways to make money when you're investing in real estate, and especially if it's commercial, if it's commercial assets, in this case, multifamily assets. Everybody has a niche, right? Well, maybe not everybody, but from what I have learned over the past is those that have longevity and they make money long-term or profits long-term. Usually they have carved out a niche. So for you, what does your process look like, right? For either identifying the niche that you're in right now or to create longevity in what you're currently doing? What is that process?
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of truth in that you hear people say the riches are in the niches, but what it is when it comes to investing or a business is the more that you do a thing, the more that you stay in that lane and repeat the process over and over, the less risky the future propositions become because you become more skilled, more competent, more capable of doing that thing well. And for us, we're really committed to staying in our lane, which is, first of all, hyper local. So we're vertically integrated. We have an in-house property management company. So we focus only in our backyard of the Twin Cities, Minnesota. So Minneapolis, St. Paul, first string suburbs, right? So that's number one focus. Number two is multifamily. We don't do office. We don't do retail. We don't do storage. We do multifamily. And in particular, what we have found to be very lucrative for us is this forgotten middle of between 20 and like 60 or 70 unit complexes where they're a little bit too big for your general, like small operator who's just maybe getting out of the duplexes and tries. Like it's a little bit too big for them to take on, but too small for the institutional players or the people who think, oh, I got to do 100 or 200 or 300 unit complex to make it worthwhile. We go in there and we find these 20 to 60 units and we just gobble them up and put them geographically next to each other. So we're looking in certain neighborhoods that we can cluster them. So it's as though we have a 300 unit complex on one block.
Okay, cool. So talk to us a little bit about kind of the economics from that process, right? Or in this case, it's really more of a strategy. Maybe not your process, but it's a strategy. So when you talk about, comparatively speaking, right, you're buying up a bunch of smaller properties, you're aggregating them. So if you were to compare the portfolio that you have today, your $30 million portfolio, right, relative to the number of units you have, to say the equivalent units of a single apartment building, comparatively speaking, what would those economics look like, right? What are the benefits, right, of you doing what you're doing versus just buying one apartment complex? And here's why I provide the comparison, because for most people, what you said is going to sound great in theory, but they're going to have no way to be able
Actualize it.
Yeah, to actualize, right, to make it real for them. So let's use that comparison, and we can kind of talk through the economics and make it make sense for the audience.
Yeah, 100%. So if all things considered, all things equal, right? If I have a cluster of buildings within like a block or two of each other, equaling 300 units, that is going to be fundamentally less efficient than a 300 unit complex. Like that's just how the reality of the situation is going to be. But there are some pros on the other side of it, which is for us, it's when we're grouping these things together, we're able then to sell them separately, right? So instead of having one big transaction, we can hold things and we can manipulate the portfolio in ways that make sense for us. So if this asset's is underperforming, or we've already kind of reached our peak IRR, now it's maybe time to dispose of it. So we have a little bit more flexibility on that side. We also then have more flexibility in terms of, okay, if we have this asset, maybe we want to redevelop it at some point. We have these two assets right next to each other. We knock them down. We go build a 40 unit in urban infill, like Class A, right? So we can do that. Whereas with the 300, you can't. So it's a little bit more optionality at the expense of efficiency.
Okay, and then so what have you quantified that opportunity, cost, and efficiency to be? Right? Is it a 10% delta? Is it a 15% delta? 20% delta?
That's a good question. I honestly don't know, because I've never crunched the numbers on it. And it's interesting because the way that we think about it, because we have in-house property management, one of the things that we do is like we don't do third-party property management. We only manage our own assets. And what that allows us to do is to run at razor thin margins, right? Because we're not trying to generate a profit on this thing. We're trying to break even so that all the value can stay inside the asset. So when it comes to like how much more efficient would a single complex be versus like 8 contiguous sites, I don't know. That's a good question. But for us, it's kind of a moot point in the sense that where we're focused within Minneapolis and Twin Cities of like the urban core, there's not a lot of big complexes. Like the inventory tends to skew towards these smaller sub 100 unit complexes anyhow. So it's not a fair comparison in the sense that there's just not actually a lot of inventory that you could comparably jump into.
Okay, so maybe let me ask the question differently. You have advertising, right? In your case, management. So advertising, repairs, and actually I'm going to break this up a little bit differently. Okay, you have advertising, you have leasing, you have grounds and maintenance, and then you have actually running a business, right? Instead of customer service, let's keep customer service out, and let's just call that running a great business. Where of those 4 buckets, where do you feel you guys execute the best?
That's a good question. So we're really good at leasing, but I would say we're actually better on the management maintenance side. And that's because within the class that we focus on, which is Class B, Class C, we've identified that the lowest hanging fruit, the lowest hanging barrier to being the best in our market is maintenance response times and the quality of maintenance response. Because what ends up happening a lot with the Class C and Class B mom and pop owners is they're not great at actually responding to their tenants. If you're in Class A and somebody has a maintenance request, it's usually, hey, you just go into the portal, you put that in there, it's done really quickly because you're a Class A apartment renter, right? The Class B, Class C, they tend to get the short shrift on that. So we focus really, really hard on that's where we're going to provide the unique selling proposition. is by being really responsive to management requests. So when they call us, they get a response within, a handful of hours, and we have somebody on site as quickly as possible dealing with the issue.
Okay. So what are your SLAs on something like that, right? Your response times. So from when someone puts in a service request in their portal to when you actually call them back and start engaging, do you have a salary maintenance tech, or do you outsource that to a third party?
So we have a salary maintenance tech on staff, but then we also work with subs, and we have a really good relationship with one particular sub who has a very robust team, and they can get people out for us because of the size of our operation. They can get people out for us next day if our on-site guy can't handle it that day. And that's really our goal. If we can get it dealt with that day, perfect. But a lot of things are going to require supplies and travel time, and it's just not feasible to get it done that day. But we're aiming always to do it within 48 hours, depending on the magnitude of the issue.
Okay, good. So what would you consider in your market? Let's just focus on your market. Mm-hmm. What would be a competitive service time, right? A response time when you get a repair request? Is it 2 hours, 3 hours? I mean, where do you start pulling away from the competition, right, in responding to and actually curing whatever the repair requirement is?
That's a good question. And I honestly don't have an answer for that, because there's two factors at play there. One is, in the space that we're playing, in that 20 to 60 unit space, a lot of the owners that we're going up against are people that have owned in this market for a really long time, and they're mom and pops in one sense, or managing in one sense. So we don't have any data necessarily on how long their response times are going to be. Then you have the other class, which is outsourcing to a third-party property management company, and they're gonna have some expected response times. But from our experience, having at the very beginning of our careers, having worked with third party, they'll tell you that they will have a response time in a certain amount of time, but then in reality, it's not that. So I don't actually have data on what the average response time is for our competitors in the market. So that's a good question.
Interesting. So how do you benchmark yourself against your competition? What do you do as a property management company? What do you benchmark against?
Oh, it's in that way. I don't compare to competitors. I look at it and say, okay, if I was in that spot, if I was the resident, what would my expectation be? And then what would it take to exceed my expectation? And so it's not about necessarily, because we know from looking at Yelp and tenant reviews and talking to our residents and saying, from your past experiences, what have been the issues? What have been the things that you hated? And they're it took too long to get maintenance, or it took too long to get a call back, or whatever. And now we look at it and say, okay, we don't necessarily care how long it was that it took it, but we look at it and say, what could we objectively say that we could deliver on? And then let's aim for that. And so it's less about looking external at the competition and more about our own internal capacity and saying, how can we hit that number?
The last time I did that, man, I lost a bunch of money.
Oh yeah. How so?
Because I wasn't being objective, right? Here's the thing. One of the things that I've learned is the hardest person to be honest with as an entrepreneur, especially at principal, is yourself. Yeah. That's why now I always have to find someone or something or data to benchmark to. Otherwise, it's just really easy to tell myself that I'm doing a really good job because it feels great. And again, the last time I did that, man, very painful, lost a bunch of money. So anyways, I just ask that because everybody's a little bit different. And I always want to, ask the question because usually the way that you answer that will reveal a bunch of different things, right? And some things that our audience can latch onto. But also, I'm going to challenge you to find a benchmark. That's my challenge.
I think it's
find a benchmark.
For sure. I think what's interesting is you're right in the sense that I think it was Richard Feynman. He's you have to, what was it? Don't fool yourself, but also recognize that you're the easiest one to fool. And it gets tied into this idea that there's levels to the game, right? And until you get exposure to the highest levels, you always think we're doing the best that we can. And then you go to that next level. So it's like the football player who goes from high school to college and oh my God, everybody's so much faster, so much stronger, so much better now. Then they get to the end of their college career and they're we're the best. And they go to NFL. It's oh my God, everybody's so much bigger, faster, stronger. Right. And so there's levels to it. And if you get into the silo of just saying oh, we're the best and we're not benchmarking, comparing. I get that. But for us, like, it's good. It's an interesting question. So we'll take it under advisement.
You're already trying to convince yourself otherwise.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
Well, hey, bud. So I know you have, a call right after this, 5:30 is when we're winding this down, but we're approaching near the end of our show. And I do want to thank you for being on. You really have been a great guest. Even though this has been a short segment, Anthony, it's been, I think, really richly packed with some golden nuggets, especially around managing and trying to find a niche, right? You did a really good job of explaining what your niche is, how you pursue it, and why you pursue it. And I think those little nuggets, man, are worth tens of thousands of dollars if, for those who can extract the learning out of that and implement. I think one of the big things that I always try to do on this show is extract things that people can implement right away, right? Because when it's all said and done, you can hear a lot of content, you can absorb a lot, but if you can't implement any of it, it's kind of useless. So I do want to appreciate you being on and actually sharing with us some things that I think are very implementable. I think that whole concept around identifying a niche and pursuing it, and then how you also talk through the benefit of aggregating, maybe not creating extreme efficiency, but what it does do is it gives you an advantage. And I think that advantage will actually create a margin for you, right? When you get really good at executing on that niche. So I do want to thank you, man, for being on. So Anthony, I've been asking you questions for the last 30 minutes. What is the one question that you have for me that you feel can add some value to our audience?
I guess going back to the original conversation about the benchmarks, I'm curious, like, what are the benchmarks that you would suggest, like, benchmarking off of?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, let me share with you what I did after all my mistakes. One of them was Google reviews. Let's leave that aside because I think everyone does that and that's readily available. But I think a really big one to really help understand how you're selling is deposits, security deposits. Benchmarking yourself in terms of security deposit, I think, is a really, really important one. Because you could be convincing yourself that you're doing a great job leasing, but comparatively speaking, if you're on average getting about a $300 security deposit for a $900 unit, and the rest of the market is doing $900 a unit, or initially what we were doing is the opposite. The market was doing $300 a unit, and we were doing $900. That started to tell me a couple of things, right? That we were really selling much better than the market. And consequently, our turnover, or rather our repair requests went down because our selling proposition became a little bit different. It's like, hey, we want to give you your deposit back so that when you leave, right? When you leave, you clean up the place, you leave it the way that you came into it. Hey, we want to give you your deposit back. And that's part of what we built into our sale. And the reason for that is they're helping to ready the unit for the next tenant for us. And it worked really, really well. We ran into a couple other issues that we had to fix, and that over time we got a little bit lax with that, and the market kind of caught up. But so that's one, is I think benchmarking your deposits, security deposits, how much you're collecting will really helped us really understand how well we were selling into that market. Google reviews is an obvious one. I think the other one is really understanding your putting an actual time around your response time in maintenance, right? Because if you don't, it's easy to say, okay, well, it took us 3 days to go out there and do that. And I think that we did a good job. But if you actually add a response time to that and you start talking about that as a team, then it becomes real, right? Then you start to understand what are all the bottlenecks that are preventing you from improving. And for us, truthfully, we just had a crappy process. So I had to rewrite all of our SOPs, one of them, which I'm making some changes to right now, because the issue was we didn't have SOPs that were defined enough to where when I had an employee that either left or I had to come in and replace them, that whoever stepped in behind them, the process wasn't mapped out clearly enough to where we can just plug someone in and they go. And that created a lot of issues for us, especially as you start to scale. So I think maintenance, you're right, I think is a huge advantage, and leasing is a huge advantage. But those are two benchmarks that the data is available in the marketplace on the security deposits. The response times, I think, are times that you're going to have to strive to be good at, and you're going to have to create yourself a stretch goal to get to that place. And when you do that, it's going to expose a lot.
Yeah. So this is good. This is really good stuff. I think on the leasing side, we tend to look at more different metrics around time on market between lease and then churn. So like how long is average resident staying, and what's the likelihood that they're going to re-up on another lease, right? And then how long between tenants is it going to take to get somebody in there? So regardless of like what the metrics are, I agree, like at the core, if you don't have a system that you can just take somebody out and plug somebody else in and they can't just hit the ground running, like you don't really have a well-oiled machine yet. And that's something that I see in a lot of businesses just in general, is like we as owners, we kind of plug in and fill the gaps in everything and make sure that they're kind of still working. But if you were to fully remove and just put somebody into that seat, like they would be lost because the system isn't clearly defined enough for them.
Yeah. And so here's the other thing too, right? Is just for us, one of the things that we had to do very differently is just get very clear on what our turn costs were, or our turn expenses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that came down to better defining our chart of accounts in that area, right? Those chart of accounts. And then making sure that we had a really good process for allocating that. And that also came down to the maintenance person, updating those work orders, right? I mean, those are some critical things. So that's my share from some recent experiences. And, hopefully that has been a little bit helpful to you and in our audience. I appreciate the question. Really good one.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Well, hey, man, I just want to thank you for being on. You've been a tremendous guest. I'm going to wish you continued success. And I'll talk to you soon, bud.
I appreciate it, John.
Anytime. Clarity of purpose creates our greatest competitive advantage. When we transform apartment buildings to thriving communities, we improve how people live and create assets with high profit margins. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this up with a friend. I'm John Brackett, bringing you things you can implement right away.